Welcome back to the Piping Pastor. Today will be a Sharp Things Saturday / belated International Pipe Smoking Day video. I didn't get a chance to celebrate on February 20th. I was in North Carolina working. And I kind of knew going into it I wasn't going to have time. I didn't even bring my pipe roll with me. It's when I travel on these trips, I'm pretty much going 16, 17-hour days. Every day I'm there. So ends up being some very long trips. So I was a little bummed out when I first had to schedule this, knowing that I'd be missing this day, but there was just no way around it, unfortunately. So I am choosing to celebrate International Pipe Smoking Day today. IPSD observed. And so for this, I decided last year that I was going to kind of go with that mutton chop piper tradition. So last year I put away a special tobacco only to be smoked on IPSD, which is in the pipe today the English blend, the house English blend I got from the Sager and Snuff in London, because it's their house blend they do themselves, and it's not as if I'm going to be nipping off to London on a regular basis to pick up their tobacco. So I thought that's a good one. That's a good one to have just set aside and just smoke it once a year. And so I haven't smoked that tobacco since I put it away over last summer, and it's a lovely smoke. I really do like it. It's a really nice, light, sweet English. So good, complex flavor, but it's singular, so it's nice. Have a special day. And to smoke it in, I'm in my giant Bilbo Baggins Meerschaum Churchwarden. I do like this pipe. So this probably won't be like a once a year pipe. I like to rotate through my pipes too much for that. But this is a rare pipe for me to smoke, and that's mainly because it's so difficult to clean. You break it down into all the component parts, and the draft on it is really narrow. So this is basically a ribbon cut or a shag cut only kind of a pipe. Now I did do some maintenance on it. I got some replacement parts for the connectors. So there's some all thread connectors that have wider draft holes than the original connectors were in there. Because the original connectors, this is an older pipe. It was an unsmoked Meerschaum I got in an estate sale, but it's an older pipe. And so the all thread connectors that were in this, because there's like 4 sections in this, had really, really narrow draft holes, much more narrow than they needed to be. So I got some wider ones, and that's helped. But it really only smokes well with a very, very well cut tobacco saw. But it's difficult to clean still, so. Although I do love my Meerschaums. Favorite pipe material to have. Well, as I mentioned in my last Sharp Things, that I was going to either do my daily carry or this other special knife. So I opted to go with the special knife. Now, this is a utility knife that I've gotten from a friend of mine, and it's Brazilian. It's a Brazilian cowboy knife. So it's meant for practical use. It's not a combat knife at all. And when I say practical use, I mean like you would use like a pocket knife for, but then also use like as a kitchen knife at a Brazilian barbecue. And it's a wonderful, beautiful knife. It's handmade. I'm going to start with just the handle and the sheath before we get into the blade. But the sheath is handmade as well. It's all hand tooled leather. This little brass piece right here is the only part on there that I think was forged and purchased, but everything else was done by hand. And the handle right here is Brazilian buffalo horn. There is a specific kind of Brazilian buffalo horn. It's called black and white. And typically the horns are like a black and white striation. And this one is solid black. So it's kind of a rare beast. and that's Brazilian hardwood. So this is all harvested legally, but this is made by hand by a friend of a friend. So a good friend of mine, a partner in ministry that I served with in Scotland, gave me this knife as a gift, and it's a significant thing. This in this particular knife as well, just because of the history of it and so forth. And I'll show you the blade here. And again, this is a hand forged blade, which you can tell when you look at it. And the really cool thing about this blade, it's incredibly strong, incredibly tough. It's not very thick. Well, it's thickish, but it's not really thick for the weight and the length and the breadth. But this was forged from a truck spring. And it's something that this not just this particular knife maker, but many knife makers in Brazil do, is repurposing hardened steel. Because hardened steel is not easy to come by, and especially at really, really high grades. But of course, the harder the steel, the better the edge, the longer lasting the edge, the more use in practical use. And so that's from the spring of a truck that was then heated and stretched and pounded and stretched and pounded and stretched and then formed into that knife blade. And it's a full tang knife. Now, when I say it's a practical use knife, it's a cowboy knife. Cowboys in Brazil, in South America in particular, that's where a lot of that cowboy culture was born, because the cattle ranches down there were massive. And these knives were used by the cowboys to carry with them, as I say, for practical use, for cutting rope and things like that. It was a tool, but then they also used it when they would barbecue and cook their meat. So the way a Brazilian barbecue works, if you've never been to a Brazilian barbecue, and I'm not talking about, a Brazilian barbecue restaurant. If you ever go to a barbecue with some Brazilians, they have the best way of doing barbecue, I think, except for maybe South Africa. But the way it's typically done is you get a bunch of different cuts of meat, and you're constantly cooking, and you're cooking the meat on the charcoal, the open fire charcoal, and you cut the meat off and put it on a cutting board and cut it, and people just like kind of come by and eat. So basically, you're out there like in the backyard all together the whole time. It's not like you cook all the meat and put it on the table with the salads and the sides, and then everybody comes together at once and then eats. It's kind of like an ongoing thing. You have like chicken hearts on a skewer, and those are like your appetizer thing. But then you're just cutting and you're putting meat out there, and people are coming by and grabbing a chunk, and it's a very social thing. So that's kind of how these knives were used as well for cutting that meat, when they would put it on the grill and they hack a chunk off and then go up and cut it on a board, and somebody else would come up and slice a piece of the meat off with their knife and just eat it. And it was just a practical social way of having a barbecue. And there was tons and tons of meat to go around, because the cows that were raised on the ranches in South America were largely raised for leather, because the primary industry in the late 1700s, early 1800s in South America was silver. It was the silver mines. And all the local economies were pointed towards that, towards mining and removing the silver. On those silver mine operations, leather was a key component for ropes and pulleys and all the various different things that they needed to move these heavy loads. They would have to use leather, which they got from the cows. So they raised the cows in order to get the leather to support the mining industry. Now, they still had the meat, of course, but in terms of profit margins, it made a lot more sense to go after the silver than to try to raise cows for meat and sell the meat, because there's no refrigeration or anything else like that. So you're in the middle of in the middle of South America. If you're raising cattle, the population's not all that great at the time, right? I mean, they hadn't the colonization had just started, so you had the indigenous people groups there, and then basically these people had to come over from Spain and Portugal and a few other places in order to mine these silver mines. So the amount of leather they needed meant that they had to raise these cows, but they had all this meat, and basically more meat than the people could eat. and it wasn't practical to try to hike the meat out of the woods, get it on ships, and sell it at some market somewhere in England or something. You'd have to salt the meat, preserve it, and then it wasn't all that great when it got there. If it got there, the losses that they would have incurred transporting the meat from anywhere they were raising it to anywhere they could sell it, it just wasn't worth it. So it made more sense just to raise the cows, skin them, use the leather, and then the meat was just whatever. As a result, you have this great historical culture in South America and Brazil and Argentina and stuff of these large amounts of meat at barbecues and things like that. So those of you who've been to Brazilian restaurants know that you sit there and people come around with these great big skewers of meat, and it's like you just eat meat as long as you can, right? As much as you can. It's a wonderful way to spend an evening, unless you're a vegan or a vegetarian. But that's where that tradition kind of comes from, and that's where that leather working kind of comes from, and that's where that knife kind of comes from. So it's a practical like utility knife, and it's also a kitchen knife. So in point of fact, I use it for both. But the reason that you need it for both sides, it needs to be very incredibly strong for all the utility work, but then it also needs to be something that you can sharpen to a very, very fine edge to be able to use in the kitchen and when you're cutting meats and so on and so forth, which means you have to have incredibly hard steel, which is why they harvest these the springs from the trucks and so on and so forth, so that you can get all that together. So a beautiful handmade knife, wonderful, beautiful, practical, and it's got a great rich history behind it that goes, all the way back to the cattle days in South America. Now, well, that is it for this time. So as I mentioned, I am celebrating IPSD today. So I am going to knock off with this video. I was thinking about doing a second one, but I'm like, yeah, you know what? I think I'm just going to spend some time today enjoying my pipe. So I'm back home. It's a long week of travel, a long week of work. I'm like, I'm just going to chill out today and enjoy this really nice tobacco that I have once a year and just sit in the chair and read for a bit, I think. So not traveling again for a couple weeks, at which time I'll be heading to Muletown. Then after Muletown, going to Georgia for more work. So I'll be around and putting some more content out, hopefully in the next week or so. But as I said, today, just me and the pipe. So I'm going to get caught up on some videos as well because I'm afraid I have not been able to watch any of your videos this week. So I will be getting to those as well. So I hope you have a lovely weekend. Hope you had a great IPSD, and we'll see you next time. Till then, happy reading.